Calvin came through our side door before dawn, with another woman's perfume on his coat and a wooden otter in his pocket. I stood at the kitchen island in my robe, cold tea beside my hand, because his midnight text about a late parent conference had stopped feeling true. He moved carefully, the way a man moves when the lie has been rehearsed in the car but still has to survive the house. His collar was open, his hair damp near one temple, and silver shimmer clung to his cuff. "You're awake," Calvin said, sounding less surprised than caught. He put his keys down and turned toward the stairs, wearing the tired smile he used when he wanted mercy before questions. The otter slipped from his coat, hit the tile, and rolled under the island. Calvin stopped so sharply his shoulder jumped, and for one clean second, his face lost everything except fear. I picked it up before he could bend. The toy was painted deep blue with a red scarf. One wheel scratched, and beneath its belly was the burned mark from the winter gift program my organization ran for families in temporary housing. "A parent's kid must have dropped that," he said. But the words arrived after his eyes had already begged the toy not to betray him. I looked from the mark to the perfume on his coat, then to the shimmer on his cuff, and the room narrowed until his story had edges. "Which parent? Calvin?" I kept my voice low because a scene would have given him something easier to accuse. He rubbed his mouth and said there were several families. It was late. I was making something innocent, ugly. Then I saw Bennett written under one wheel in blue marker. Uneven and careful. The kind of name written for a child who still loses things. Calvin saw me read it, and the color left his face again. "Give it back," he said. "Not please. Not let me explain. Just give it back." As if command could make ownership true. I placed the otter inside a cloth bag and told him to go shower. When water began running upstairs, I photographed every side, opened the secure support registry, and typed Bennett Ellis. I drove to the housing office while Calvin was still upstairs, pretending sleep could turn evidence back into coincidence. The building sat behind a grocery store and a bus stop, the kind of place people found when their lives had become too tight to carry alone. Elise Porter was at her desk before the phones started ringing. Sleeves pushed up, reading glasses low on her nose, coffee untouched beside intake folders. I set my phone on the desk with the photos open, and she did not ask why my hand stayed flat against the wood. "That otter came from our winter shelf," Elise murmured, turning the image toward herself. She opened the secure registry, entered the burned code beneath the toy, and the file appeared before either of us could soften for it. Marin Ellis. Temporary housing transition request. Dependent listed as Bennett Ellis. Community verifier Calvin Price. My throat closed around the name, not because Marin existed, but because Calvin had signed himself into the lie with his own handwriting. Elise scrolled slowly, careful not to move faster than the truth. The request said Marin was a single mother facing a short-term housing disruption, and Calvin had confirmed her connection through the school where he worked. He had not written husband, father, affair, or secret, only professional contact, as if one tidy phrase could rinse the page clean. "This needs review," Elise said. And I nodded because review was the only word in that room that still felt safe. I told her to remove Calvin from every approval path tied to my organization and to flag the file for compliance, but not to stop anything already given to Bennett. The child had not signed the form, had not carried the otter into my kitchen, had not taught Calvin how to lie before sunrise. Elise looked at me once, then lowered her eyes and followed the process exactly. Outside, my phone buzzed with Calvin's name, then buzzed again. And when his message appeared, it did not ask where I was or whether I was okay. It asked, "Where is the otter?" I typed one word, "Safe," and watched the 3 dots appear, vanish, then return like panic, trying to dress itself as authority. Calvin came home before dinner with takeout from the Thai place I liked, and the soft voice he used when he wanted the room to forgive him first. He set the bag on the table, loosened his tie, and acted as if sesame noodles could cover the smell still caught in my memory. I placed the cloth bag beside his plate, and the wooden otter inside made a small, dull sound against the table. His eyes dropped to it before he looked at me, and that was the first honest thing he gave me all day. "Who is Bennett Ellis?" "Calvin?" His mouth tightened, then softened too fast. "Bridget. She is an employee at school who had a rough stretch. And I helped her with a resource because that is what decent people do." I watched him lean into the word decent like it belonged to him. "You signed her housing support request," I said, "and you came home before sunrise with her child's toy in your pocket." He looked toward the window, not at me, and said I was turning kindness into something ugly. "Is Bennett your child?" The question landed clean, with nowhere for him to fold it. He rubbed the side of his jaw and told me this was not a conversation to have while I was emotional, though my hands were still on the table and my voice had not moved. I asked again, and the pause that followed did more damage than any confession could have done quickly. "Bennett is my son," he finally breathed, then rushed forward with all the words he had saved. For the moment, truth cornered him. He said our marriage had been lonely. Marin understood him, and he never meant for anyone to get hurt. As if 5 years of hiding could be softened by poor timing. I asked whether Marin knew. I had no idea, and he answered with his eyes before his mouth found a smaller lie. He said he had responsibilities to his child, and I told him responsibility did not require a false support form or perfume on his coat at dawn. Then I asked for his house keys, his organization access card, and every pass connected to my work. He laughed once, thin and nervous. So I opened the security app and changed the front door code while he watched the green light turn red. Calvin left with one overnight bag and the injured confidence of a man who believed locked doors were temporary when they belonged to his wife. He took 2 shirts, a charger, and the gray coat that still carried the faint sweetness I could smell from the stairs. His watches stayed in the drawer. His winter boots stayed by the mudroom, and his school binders stayed on the shelf because he thought absence was a tactic, not a change. I let him leave without correcting the story he was telling himself. By morning, the second layer had already opened. The spring scholarship fundraiser at Northline Academy was scheduled to feature Marin as a strong, single mother supported by the school community, and Calvin's name sat beside hers in the draft program as the man introducing her story. He was not only hiding Bennett from me, he was preparing to stand in a room full of parents, donors, and teachers and turn his secret into something clean enough to applaud. I called Grant Whitford before the school day settled into routine. He ran operations at Northline with the tired patience of a man who knew every polished event had a plumbing problem somewhere behind it. I kept my voice level and told him there was a conflict in a support file tied to Marin Ellis, verified by Calvin Price, and connected to a public story the school planned to use. Grant was quiet long enough for the paper trail to matter, then asked me to send only what policy allowed. Nothing personal, nothing about the child beyond what the form already showed. When the documents reached him, his reply came back shorter than I expected. The Marin segment was being removed pending review, and Calvin would no longer approve scholarship language without oversight. That was the first visible crack outside our house, small but impossible to call emotional. Then Marin called me, her voice tight, asking why I was dragging Bennett into adult confusion. I told her adults had already done that when one signed a false support request and the other carried the proof home before sunrise. She went silent when I asked whether Calvin had told her I did not know Bennett existed, and that silence told me exactly where her version of the story had begun to rot. Calvin arrived at Northline Academy, looking polished enough to fool anyone who had not seen him lose control in my kitchen. His office badge no longer opened the staff conference room, and the tiny red blink on the reader did more to humble him than anything I could have said. Grant Whitford let him in from the inside. Not as a favor, but as a boundary with a witness. Marin was already seated near the far end of the table, hands folded too tightly, while Elise placed one thin folder between us. "This is a family matter," Calvin began, keeping his voice low because low voices had always helped him sound reasonable. Grant looked at the folder, then at him, and told him the school had a responsibility when an employee verified a support request tied to another employee and then planned to use that story in a fundraiser. Marin turned toward Calvin, her face changing before she spoke. "You said it was an employee resource," she said, "not an outside housing support file." Calvin's jaw tightened, and for the first time that morning, the room saw the lie split in two directions. Elise opened the folder and pointed to the section Marin had signed. Not dramatically, just accurately. The language was plain enough for anyone at that table to understand, and that made it worse. Marin looked down at her own signature like it had become strange to her. "I trusted what Calvin told me," she whispered, and I almost felt sorry for her until I remembered the silence after I asked whether she knew I existed in the dark. Calvin leaned forward and said Bennett should not be punished because adults were complicated. Grant asked whether Bennett was his child, and Calvin snapped. "He is my son," before the sentence had permission to survive the room. Nobody moved for a second. Then Grant closed the folder and told Calvin he was on administrative leave from admissions decisions, and Marin would be removed from parent-facing duties while the review continued. Calvin looked at me as if I had stolen something from him, but all I had done was let his own words arrive where his charm could not clean them. The fundraiser went on because Grant and I refused to let Calvin turn every useful thing into proof of his importance. Northline Academy's dining hall filled with parents in winter coats, teachers carrying donation envelopes, and scholarship families who had no reason to pay for the choices he made. The revised program had no Marin segment. "No, Calvin, welcome." No single mother story polished for applause. My part lasted less than 3 minutes, and I kept it where it belonged. On housing support, truthful applications, and the families who needed both without being used. Calvin arrived anyway, wearing the navy suit he saved for parent nights and walking beside Marin as if confidence could restore his name to the program. She looked beautiful in a quiet cream dress, but there was strain around her mouth now. The kind makeup could not soften. He worked the edge of the room first, smiling at trustees, touching elbows, letting people assume his absence from the stage was scheduling. I watched him discover, person by person, that polite smiles could become locked doors without anyone raising a voice. Dana Whitlock found him near the dessert table, recorder in her hand, and the careful face of someone who had once liked him. Calvin leaned toward her and murmured that I was letting personal pain interfere with school business. But Dana looked past him at the revised program, then back at his badge. "If this is personal, why did your signature end up on a housing support file tied to the story you wanted on stage?" The question was not loud, but Marin heard it, and so did two parents waiting for coffee. Calvin's smile held for 1 second too long before it failed. He said the school would clarify everything, but Grant stepped beside us and answered that an independent review was already underway and staff with conflicts had been removed from related duties. Marin's face changed when she heard herself included in that sentence. By the next morning, the school's thank you email named the teachers, volunteers, scholarship families, and donors, but not Calvin. And Marin's parent liaison profile had quietly disappeared. He had not been shouted out of the room. He had simply become too risky for the room to keep pretending he belonged. Calvin came back 3 nights after the fundraiser, standing in cold rain with a cardboard box under one arm. I watched through the doorbell screen while water slid down his face and made him look more abandoned than sorry. "Bridget, open the door," he breathed into the speaker, then glanced toward the street as if a neighbor might see him. I did not open it, because every locked door between us existed for a reason he had given me. He said Marin had left. Northline was not returning his calls. and parents who once laughed beside him now stepped around him in grocery aisles. His voice cracked when he said, "I could calm this down if I called the housing form a misunderstanding and our marriage private for years." That sentence told me what he missed. Not me. Not the house. Not the years. But the cover my quiet had given him. "You want me to lie better than you did?" Calvin. And he closed his eyes like the truth had insulted him. He placed the box on the step before leaving, and I waited until his car disappeared before opening the door. Inside was a cream baby blanket with Bennett stitched into one corner in blue thread. My knees softened before my mind caught up, because I knew the blanket. My mother had bought it for the child Calvin and I once thought we might have, before the nursery door stayed closed, and he told me we could still be whole without a baby. He had not bought Bennett a blanket after his son was born. He had taken one from the life I grieved and handed it into the life he hid. I washed it, dried it, folded it into a clean box, and called Marin to collect it, because Bennett had slept under it and that mattered more than where it began. When Marin saw the stitching and heard the truth, her face changed the way mine had when the otter first hit the kitchen floor. Northline finished its review the way real consequences usually arrive. Not with sirens, but with signatures, locked accounts, and people choosing not to return calls. Calvin was removed from admissions after Grant found the conflict in Marin's support file, the fundraiser language, and the approvals Calvin had given himself. The school did not shout about him. His name disappeared from the enrollment page, the parent welcome packet, and the thank you email. Marin resigned before the final meeting, and I heard later that she had taken an administrative job where nobody asked her to smile beside donor boards. When she came for the blanket, she did not ask me to forgive her, only stood with the box against her ribs and said Bennett slept with it when he was sick. "Keep it with him," I answered, because the child had not stolen anything from me. Her eyes filled, but she nodded and left without making her shame my responsibility. My attorney filed the separation cleanly under Minnesota law, keeping my house, organization, and records separate from Calvin's collapse. He told people I was using paperwork to punish him, but the paperwork only repeated what the doorbell screen, support form, and his own words had shown. Elise rebuilt the approval process so no verifier could slide a personal story through again. Grant kept Northline steady by telling parents the truth without feeding them the child's name. And Dana wrote carefully about community trust without turning Bennett into a headline. I did not fall in love with someone new by summer, and I did not need to. I turned the quiet room upstairs into a reading space, put the blue otter on the shelf, and stopped letting it feel like the object that broke my life. Months later, Marin sent a card saying Bennett still had the otter and knew it came from a place that helped families honestly. I placed the card in a file, not a memory box, then made tea where Calvin's lie first hit the floor and realized the house no longer sounded empty.